Okay, so we are looking at section, whoops, hold on. There we go. We're looking at section two of our unit about the War of 1812. And sometimes this is called America's Forgotten War. This is a war that is really pitting the ideas of imperialism, which we learned about when we were studying the French and Indian War. This idea that a country wants to take over another country for land, money, and power, versus expansionism. So people in the United States are starting to expand west. Well, what are we going to do with that land? Are we just going there to farm? Do we want to expand businesses? And what impact is all of that expansion having on Native Americans, on our trade with the British? Because remember, we're supposed to be splitting or sharing the Mississippi River. Um, so there are a lot of factors that are going to kind of come to play. But first, I want to show you this very quick video that kind of highlights, I would say, the average American's understanding of the War of 1812.
Why do men fight?
For honor, Sarah. For honor.
Okay, but like really, why?
Honor was vague, right?
Yeah,
It might have something to do with taxes.
yeah, that makes sense.
I have to go.
Where?
Out west. Maybe really far south. Maybe Canada.
When will you return?
You know what? I might have to go out to sea.
And if you see an engine, shoot!
Wait, I thought the Indians were on our side.
I thought they were with the British.
Didn't we already fight the British?
I died to protect England's right to
what?
to what?
My people are involved in this somehow.
Who did this?
Seriously, who did this? I don't know.
It was General Grant's army. Ulysses S. Grant.
That can't be right.
You know, I was sure it was right before I said it. But it did sound kind of weird once it came out of my mouth. Funny how that happens, you know?
No.
No!
We will rise against the British and the Indians and the French. No. No, not the French. Not the French. Sorry. Yes, the French. Final answer. They may burn our crops. They may take our land. There could be provinces involved. We will stand strong. We will charge. We will charge. We will take their territories one by one. No. We will do what I said before. We'll just protect the frontier. Huh? Okay. Protect the frontier!
Yeah.
Let's give it a shot! What happened during this time? Wikipedia had nothing!
Yeah, so that pretty much summarizes our average understanding of the War of 1812. Hopefully, I can shed a little bit more light as to why people were fighting. Just a little bit of background reminders. In 1783, when we signed the Treaty of Paris ending the Revolutionary War, the British and the U.S. were supposed to share the Mississippi River, and it kind of indicated at that time that this was going to be a cause of the next war, which it will be. Excuse me. In 1803, Thomas Jefferson bought the Louisiana Purchase, as you have already learned about. And in so doing, the United States has this idea that it also owns the Mississippi River. So that creates more tension between the British and the United States. And so the British Navy starts to seize sailors from U.S. ships, saying that they are from the Royal Navy and they have abandoned their posts with the British. They went AWOL to join the U.S. Navy. And so this is going to start to create a problem when the British start seizing American citizens. Well, most of them were American citizens. And that's something that's actually called impressment, which means you force men into military service. So some of these men on these ships were on merchant ships and weren't actually naval ships. So the British were also taking average citizens off of ships and forcing them into the British Navy. In an effort to stop that, Thomas Jefferson, who was still president in 1807, imposed an embargo. And an embargo is when you just enact some penalties on a country, trade penalties on a country. And so what Jefferson said was that we will suspend all trade with Great Britain and France, and all American ships had to stay in port. So that basically also cancels out any of our exports that we could send to other countries if all American ships have to stay in port. So while he sees this as an alternative to war, it actually hurts American citizens much more than the British, because if we have a large shipping industry at that time, it's putting people out of a job. Trade goods that merchants would use to sell to people are gone, and any exports that we have for agricultural purposes. So if we're growing things agriculturally to send to other countries, well, now those things aren't going out to other countries. So it's also hurting our agricultural industry at this time, which is what the majority of Americans are involved in. Now, the British said, that's fine. You want to have your little embargo. We're going to sign something called an Orders in Council. And so they said that they're basically telling the U.S. and France that they can't trade with each other. The British are saying that. Well, the French aren't going to be cool with that because the French are not friends with the British. And of course, the U.S. is going to be like, well, we're an independent nation. You can't tell us we can't trade with France, even though Thomas Jefferson just did. So it's a very confusing mess of pieces of paper that are signed that at some point merchants and the shipping industry will say are useless. Now in 1809, James Madison is president, and he sees how much this embargo has hurt the country economically, and he signs something called the Non-Intercourse Act. So what this does is gets rid of the Embargo Act and says that we can trade with all countries except for France and Great Britain. So, okay, fine. That's great. We can now send our ships out, basically is what that does. Lets American ships leave American ports. So how will James Madison know where our ships are going? It's 1809. We have no GPS. We don't have satellites. It's very easy once a ship leaves port to change its course, perhaps fly a flag of a different country once it gets far enough out to sea so it's not recognized as an American ship. I mean, these merchant vessels are going to get pretty inventive on how they can get their goods actually to Great Britain and to France to continue trade. So it's virtually impossible to enforce this act. Now, today, of course, it'd be super easy because we have satellites. But there are lots of causes of the War of 1812. It would be nice if we could just boil it down to like one cause of a war, but that just never happens in any war. So one of the main causes, the thing that really irritates Americans in general, is the fact that the British keep impressing who we view to be American citizens from American ships. So in essence, kidnapping people off of our ships. And Great Britain telling us who we can and can't trade with. We just won a war for independence from Great Britain. a generation ago? Why do we want them now to be dictating our trade? There are a couple more causes that are also important to talk about. Cause number 2, Native Americans are really pushing back against westward expansion. In that College Humor video that we saw at the beginning of the notes, the commanding officer was like, well, we're just going to protect the frontier. Well, what is the frontier at that time would be like the Ohio River Valley. So if you can think geographically, Ohio straight down south, all the way to the Mississippi River, that's an Ohio River Valley. And so that's supposed to be the frontier, where Native Americans were told, this is definitely your land, after the proclamation line was drawn, and that Americans were not supposed to encroach on that land anymore. Well, guess what we were doing? We were encroaching on that land. And so there's a big pushback by Native Americans against this expansion. It's causing quite a bit of tension. And so Native Americans start to support the British because they don't want Americans taking their land. It's just as simple as that. The other big reason has to do with politics. We have to decide if we're going to support Britain or France, as far as who we're going to trade with, whose military we're okay to be allies with. And there were people in Congress who fought to go both sides. So we had, at this time, our 2 main political parties were Republicans, but not like Republicans that you'd think of today. They were more like the Democrats of today. It's a long, complicated political science lesson, which we could get into one-on-one if you really want to know about it. But those individuals thought that we should side with the British. And then we had the Federalists still, who were pro-France. The French weren't coming in and taking our men. The French weren't telling us who we could and couldn't trade with. So it wasn't they weren't hurting our commerce. So, that bickering back and forth in Congress really made it difficult for the average American citizen to know whose side are we on? Are we fighting the British? Are we fighting the French? Are we fighting Native Americans? We just don't know. This is really confusing. Why are we fighting? So this is the geographical area that we're looking at. So everything in purple is an official state at that time. So you can see we've added a few states since the last time we did a geography activity. We've got Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee, and Louisiana now. So yay for you guys. And then some places that are actually considered to be U.S. territory. So you can see when we're talking about Native American tensions, you can see that there really has been a lot of expansion into Native American territory. And so it makes perfect sense that they would want to support the British with the hopes that perhaps they could push Americans back beyond that proclamation line. Whoops. Okay. So now there are 3 main phases of the war. And what I mean by phases, I'm talking about geographical areas where the war is fought. So, the first is we're talking about U.S. forces invading positions in Canada. There's a great amount of fighting that's going to happen in Michigan and in Ohio and Wisconsin and New York along the Canadian border, where people are actually going to be fighting for where we place the border between Canada and the United States. Also, we have French citizens and British citizens living in Canada. Who do they support? It's very confusing. No one really knows. And then what about the Canadians who would like to have their independence? But we'll talk about that in a little bit. Another phase of war would be the fighting that's going to happen in the Washington, D.C., Chesapeake Bay area. So we're talking from Maryland all the way down to Virginia. There's a lot of fighting that's happening there because we're talking about an area that involves our capital. See, here's the thing. Our soldiers in the first phase of war went to Canada and burned down their parliament building. So the second phase of war, they're going to come down and burn our White House and try to burn our Capitol building. And So it's just like a tit for tat constantly. And then the final campaign is going to be the Southern campaign. Some of that's actually going to be taking place after the war is over. It's crazy. That music's historically inaccurate, but whatever.
General Winder decides to make a stand to defend Washington 10 miles from the White House. And here, on the eastern branch of the Potomac, is where the fate of Washington is going to be decided.
Winder makes his stand at Bladensburg, Maryland, just 6 miles from Washington, in what will be one of the most notorious American military embarrassments of the entire war. There, on August 24th, his hastily gathered, inexperienced defenders face off against veteran troops under Major General Robert Ross, the commander of the land-based invasion force.
Ross, in many ways, is the ideal combat commander. He's aggressive, he's brave, and he leads at the head of his troops. He doesn't expect anyone to do something he's not willing to take on himself.
On Ross's order, British troops advanced toward the first of 3 American lines. They quickly outflanked the defenders and forced them to retreat. As the British moved toward the second line, American artillery blasts the oncoming light brigade. Despite this deadly onslaught, the second line begins to break.
Most of the British soldiers under Ross are veterans of the Peninsula War. They've been up against some of the best troops in the world, the French. And they're just amazed, however, at how slight the resistance is from the Americans. They expected more from Yankee Doodle.
The third line makes a desperate last stand until the British finally overrun them.
Notice they're
General
still
Winder
fighting
orders
out in
a
the
retreat
open.
that turns into a
Revolutionary War
panic-stricken race
style.
back to Washington. They run so fast that the Redcoats suffer heat stroke trying to keep up with them. Charles Ball, a free black and one of the defenders on that third line, recalls the last moments of what will go down in history as the Bladensburg races.
If the militia regiments could have been brought to charge the British, we should have killed or taken the whole of them in a short time. But the militia ran like sheep chased by dogs.
In just 1 hour, all resistance has been wiped off the map. Now nothing stands in the way of the British as they advance toward Washington, less than 1 day's march away. Madison realizes that the onslaught is inevitable and seeks to remove himself from harm's way.
Maybe it's something like George Bush on 9/11. He's trying to find a place where he can get a hold of the situation, find out what's happening, make sure that there's not going to be more trouble in Washington, and if there is, he wants to be somewhere else.
In the aftermath of the battle, the once flourishing capital is becoming a ghost town as government officials flee the city. Battered American troops staggering back into Washington have no information of the president's whereabouts. Within hours, the British invasion force will enter Washington. As the capital descends into chaos and with the president and members of his cabinet unaccounted for, one woman will spearhead the last defense of the seat of power before the Redcoats put it to the torch. August 24th, 1814, would go down as one of the blackest days in American history. It began with a humiliating defeat at Bladensburg, Maryland, and ended with the destruction of the nation's capital. The events of this one day would test the mettle of a young nation and provide some of the most memorable moments in America's so-called forgotten war. While the British overrun American forces and advance on Washington, just 6 miles away, one woman remains firmly entrenched in the White House, the First Lady, Dolly Madison.
Dolly Madison is my favorite character in American history. And the reason is this woman is not only courageous and heroic, risking her life to save things for posterity. This is a woman who is beloved, the most beloved woman ever to occupy the White House, admired and respected by the rich absolutely beloved by the poor.
Dolly and James Madison make up one of the oddest couples in Washington. While the president was bookish and introverted, she was the life of the party. She loved to dip snuff, play cards, and scoop ice cream, all while modeling the labors the British would be at the doorstep of the house she had transformed into the center of Washington society. She receives word from her husband, who's out rallying troops. Evacuate the White House. As the desperate minutes dwindle, Dolly Madison heads for a national treasure.
This is a woman who, at the risk of her life, while the British are advancing on Washington and the male guards have fled from around the White House, this lady decides to save George Washington's portrait, painted by Gilbert Stuart, for the single reason that it has to be protected and saved for future generations. Which one of us, male or female today, would risk our lives for a painting? And she did that.
I insist on waiting till the large picture of General Washington is taken, so I have ordered the frame to be broken and the painting taken out. It is done.
The First Lady is among the last to evacuate the city. She finally boards her carriage, searching for her husband. By 8 p.m., British forces, led by Major General Ross, enter Washington.
It was never expected that an army of 4,000 men could march with little or no difficulty, take and have at its mercy the capital of the United States.
In retaliation for burning the Canadian Parliament at York the previous April, British troops prepare to set fire to Washington's government buildings. Redcoats, under the command of Vice Admiral Coburn, break into the Capitol. They stage a mock legislation and vote unanimously to burn the building. One resident watches the fire from her rooftop.
No drawing room was ever as brilliantly lit as the whole city that night. As flames burst through the roof of the Capitol, there was a roll of thunder.
At about 10:30 p.m., the men move on to another key government target, the White House. In the dining room, they find the table set. Coburn orders wine poured, and in a sarcastic toast to the president, drinks to Jemmy's health. Soldiers rampage through the rooms, grabbing souvenirs, including the ceremonial sword and a pair of rhinestone buckles. Even Major General Ross pockets President Madison's love letters to Dolly. Outside the mansion, the Redcoats pitch their torches through the windows, engulfing the White House in flames.
The destruction of Washington's public buildings, these fires, the glow of which was seen 50 miles away, struck at the hearts of many Americans wherever they were.
Every American heart is bursting with shame and indignation at the catastrophe, recalls George Douglas, a militia private. Perhaps no one feels the emotions more deeply than President Madison, who watches the fires from horseback in Virginia.
There's no sign of panic. There was intense concern about making sure the government didn't fold up, and he felt, of course, a responsibility. At that stage, Madison was thinking, where would he find Dolly? Where would the rest of the government be? How could he reconvene them to show that the government could still function and still exist in an effective form?
The next morning, August 25th, the British set the Library of Congress and the Navy Yard afire as storm clouds threaten overhead.
Okay, but what that video doesn't tell you, because it cuts off, is that as the British leave, it's one of the worst storms that hits Maryland. In fact, many of those British soldiers are killed by a tornado, and they'd never seen tornadoes before. So that's like a little bit of karma.
Certainly the burning of Washington is not the most important battle or the only battle that's happening during the War of 1812. But it is one that's significant because, as was discussed at the end of that video, now what do we do to make sure that our government is still in power, that our government can still function as it's supposed to function for our people? And that was a true challenge of our constitutional beliefs and of the people who were in charge at that time. So it is important in those respects. There are quite a few important battles that are taking place, some of them on the water. And if you are really interested in learning about the battles of 1812, perhaps this is a project that you want to pick for your semester project that we'll be doing in lieu of an actual test. So just keep that in mind. I'm going to go ahead and jump to, the end of the War of 1812, which ends with something called the Treaty of Ghent in 1814. So the war lasts approximately 2 years. And what this treaty says is that the British can't restrict trade anymore. So the British will end their trade restrictions, and they have to leave the U.S. frontier. So troops that are in our territories, for example, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin territories, they have to get out. No more sharing the Mississippi River. Any land that was held prior to the War of 1812 by citizens and technically Native Americans is supposed to be restored.
Basically, both nations wanted an end to this war. The United States possibly more than Britain, because the country was bankrupt by this time.
In many ways, the War of 1812 was America's first Vietnam. Why? Because by 1814, there were student demonstrations in Baltimore, throughout New England. People were disenchanted with the way the government had pursued this war. It was clear that it was not going to be a victory.
The British public was really war weary. They were weary of the conflicts. They wanted people back home. More than anything else, they were weary of the expense of war. The national debt had soared over the years since 1799, and it really was creating a tax nightmare. So for most British people, they wanted an end to this war.
The Treaty of Ghent was Madison's last best hope, in his view, for getting out of a war that was clearly not going well on any level. And the British saw it the same way. The British sent third-rate negotiators. We sent some of our smartest people. As a result, we probably did better at the treaty than we did on the battlefield in most cases.
To be fair to say, what the United States lost on the battlefield, they gained back at the negotiating table.
Britain's war aims were for the war to end. A lot of what the British did during the War of 1812, the whole campaign in 1814, the campaign in Baltimore, the capture of Washington, they were all designed to try and force the Americans to the negotiating table.
Again, the British have sent a commission and the United States has sent a commission. They've all come with their relative points that they want in terms of territorial gains, rights of trade, impressment, that is taking sailors off of a ship and putting them into your own navy, a whole series of factors. And as the talks go on, you slowly see each one of these negotiating points, if you will, being pulled away, because it's evident that they just want the war to end.
The one thing that the British government wanted was provision for the Aboriginal peoples. This had been a disastrous part of the Treaty of Paris, which established the United States in 1783, no provision had been made for the Aboriginal peoples who fought for the crown.
He's talking about Native
In the
Americans.
larger scope of things, that the British didn't really plan for them to become a part of British society, maybe as subjects, and but not as equals.
At one point, the British proposed there should be an Aboriginal barrier state, which would be roughly the western part of what was known as the Old Northwest.
But even if that had been agreed to, that simply would prevent Americans from buying lands from Indians. There would be no a treaty provision there that would prevent Americans from seizing the land in what they claimed was a just war. So I don't think there was any way the Indians were going to halt or roll back westward expansion, regardless of the outcome of the War of 1812.
I can't help but think, though, every now and then, did they really mean what they said when they made these treaties? Were they just using us, duping us into, lulling us into complacency with the ultimate goal to take the land?
The Indians never really trusted the British. They pretty much had got the idea right. They knew the British would help them as long as it suited Britain. And they were not there to help the Indians for the sake of the Indians.
It's very interesting to follow the record of the weekly or sometimes daily sessions between the British and American representatives. As a British victory would come in, the British position was strengthened, and then American victory would come in, and the American position was strengthened. And the thing was, throughout most of the summer of 1814, the British were on the offensive diplomatically, but then after Plattsburgh, Fort McHenry, etc., they had to back off.
The Treaty of Ghent is fraught with ironies. It solves none of the war's issues, perhaps foremost. It announces the status quo ante bellum, the state of things before the war, and so none of the war's causes are addressed in any way. The orders in council, the economic difficulties, the neutral rights that the Americans were so fervent about at the beginning of the war are repealed before the war is even declared. There is no statement about impressment as a policy as a result of the treaty. The Native American situation is destroyed with Tecumseh's destruction. And actually, the Treaty of Ghent talks about the honoring of Native American lands, which are pretty much ignored in the outcome. And so none of the war's causes are truly addressed. It simply makes the whole thing go away. It's a tie.
So we'll come back to that idea of it's a tie. So what happens is the Treaty of Ghent is agreed upon and signed in December of 1814. Well, you know, we can't tweet these things out. We can't just call people and say, hey, war's over. We don't have telegraph system yet. And so nobody told Andrew Jackson, or if they did, the message didn't get there in time. So Andrew Jackson is in charge of the Southern, zoom in here. He's in charge of the Southern campaign. And so in January of 1815, Andrew Jackson is going to lead a group of, it's like the Island of Misfit Toys from Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. He leads pirates, he leads free blacks, he leads militia. So these are people who are going to fight guerrilla warfare tactics. And they're going to attack the British that are still sitting in the port of New Orleans. And they're going to force the British to surrender. And by the time they actually start fighting, Jackson gets news about the Treaty of Ghent, so he can justify the fighting by saying, well, now we're going to make sure that they honor that, and they actually leave. So here is probably a song that some of you grew up listening to, but this one's actually acted out by Legos to kind of talk about the Battle of New Orleans.
Jackson down the mighty Mississippi. We took a little bacon and we took a little beans, and we caught the bloody British in a town in New Orleans. We fired our guns and the British kept a-coming. There wasn't as many as there was a while ago. We fired once more and they began to run it on down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. We looked down the river and we see the British come, and there must have been 100 of them beating on the drum. They stepped so high and they made the bugles ring. We stood beside our cotton bales, didn't say a thing. We fired our guns and the British kept a-coming. There wasn't as many as there was a while ago. We fired once more and they began to run it on down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. Old Hickory said we could take them by surprise if we didn't fire muskets till we looked them in the eye. We held our fire till we see their faces well. Then we opened up our squirrel guns and really gave them well. We fired our guns and the British kept it coming. There wasn't as many as there was a while ago. We fired once more and they began to run it on down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. Yeah, they ran through the briars and they ran through the brambles and they ran through the bushes where a rabbit couldn't go. They ran so fast that the hounds couldn't catch them on down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico.
Probably not a lot of elephants in the Gulf of Mexico.
We fired our cannon till the barrel melted down. So we grabbed an alligator and we fought another round. We filled his head with cannonballs and powdered his behind. And when we took the powder off, the gator lost his mind. We fired our guns and the British kept a-coming. There wasn't as many as there was a while ago. We fired once more and they began to run it on down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. Yeah, they ran through the briars and they ran through the brambles and they ran through the bushes where a rabbit couldn't go.
Lots of dragons in the Gulf of the Gulf of Mexico. Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, so some other highlights. I don't believe there's a spot in your notes to write these down, so you don't have to worry about writing them down, but I just thought it was important to kind of highlight a couple of things about the War of 1812. So our White House, which was brand new, by the way, was burned by the British. This is the first time that the U.S. is going to use a Navy for battles, so that's significant. Most of those battles are going to be taking place in the Gulf of Mexico, as well as the Chesapeake Bay area around between Maryland and Virginia. Andrew Jackson is going to be a war hero. We'll be talking more about Andrew Jackson in a later lesson in this unit. The Star Spangled Banner is composed during the War of 1812 by Francis Scott Key, who is witnessing a battle that's happening in Baltimore, and you're going to learn a little bit more about that as well. There are absolutely no winners in the War of 1812, as you saw from that video. This is a tie. No one gains anything from this, with the exception that we are proven to have stability in our government. If something horrific happens, our government can still regroup and still protect us. So with all of that stuff, this is like a nothing war. Who cares? Who really cares about the War of 1812? Well, there's one specific group who cares. Canadians care, because this actually becomes their first step toward Canadian independence, which they will gain in the 1850s. They really start to exercise pushing the British and the French out of different Canadian territories and trying to claim independence. So it's important for them. For us, not so much, because nothing is accomplished. But it's still important for us to think about the impact on our government and the fact that this gives our Navy its first real opportunity to test itself. So there is the short and sweet version of the War of 1812. Like I said, if you're interested in learning more, this would be a great topic for your semester project.